desperately need more women, more people of color, more underrepresented groups in our innovation economy.
Welcome to Elevating Conversations presented by AnitaB.org. I'm your host, Dr. Kai Two Feathers Orton, Anita B. Fellow in Residence. My pronouns are she, her. Tansi, which means hello in Hia, or also known as Cree, my mother tongue, to any visually impaired members of our audience. I would like to provide a visual description of myself. I'm a First Nations Indigenous woman with dark brown, wavy shoulder-length hair and cinnamon-toned skin. Today, I'm wearing a summery gray and white striped seersucker blazer, a white blouse, and traditional beaded earrings. We at Anita B started Elevating Conversations back in 2020 as a vehicle to convene the most brilliant minds across the tech landscape. We discuss current industry events, how to navigate opportunities in today's tech world, and provide resources for our attendees after each discussion. At the forefront, we seek to address the most pressing issues women and non-binary technologists face today and are committed to envisioning a future of inclusive technology. While we should be celebrating generations of LGBTQIA+ community who fought for equality and human rights and recognizing current trailblazers, we are still faced with an onslaught of anti-LGBTQIA+ legislation being passed across the country. We remain steadfast in our belief that this dialogue is necessary to continue creating the change we want to see, no matter who we are, where we work, or what we do. So thank you all for tuning in to today's Fireside Chat. As we reflect on the past few years of the pandemic, everyone is keenly aware of the very real ways our lives have changed, from personal lived experiences to drastic shifts in our sociocultural lives, to changes in our policies and laws, which can have dangerous implications for equity, fairness, and safety. To say that the past few years have been challenging would be an understatement. Bodies of power have been challenged. Racial and economic disparities have deepened, especially for people of color and our LGBTQIA+ community, and all people seeking autonomy over their body. Journalist Robert Hamilton recently named the top social justice challenges that have defined society for the past few years. The list aptly highlights what is at stake for maintaining the progress we've made in the past few decades towards building a more inclusive and equitable society and just futures for all people. Election officials' responses to the pandemic severely hampered some people's ability to vote in primary elections, but access improved by the time the 2020 November general election happened. We witnessed organizations such as the NASW, the ADL, and the ACLU actively fight for voting access to all US citizens. Despite Roe versus Wade passing nearly 50 years ago today, body autonomy is still an ongoing issue in the United States. Abortion is one of the most divisive topics in the USA in 2022, with many states newly restricting access. With protests and rioting from both sides of this issue, Florida has become the stage for many of these ongoing legal debates. Discrimination in the United States is a problem as old as the country itself, perhaps even older. Its roots can be found in education, business, media, and the mundane of our daily lives. Furthermore, the rights and visibility of LGBTQIA+ community has been a longstanding issue in the US and around the world. Members of the LGBTQIA+ community are still frequent victims of erasure, harassment, and violence. They are often unable to access the same educational, healthcare, economic, and political opportunities. Today's conversation centers around the Florida Don't Say Gay or Trans bill and the intersectional problems and challenges weighing heavily on our hearts and in the LGBTQIA+ community allies across the country. Before I turn it over, let us know where you're tuning in from the chat. We'd love to know where you are, if you're in Florida, if you're in Denver like me, anywhere that you are in the country, we'd love to hear from you. Looks like we have people tuning in from the Bay Area, Las Vegas, Seattle, wow, Florida, Miami, so many places, San Antonio, Texas, New Jersey, Ohio, Virginia, Indianapolis, Atlanta, New Mexico. We have a great audience today tuning in from all over the country. We've got the Midwest, Chicago, LA, and California, Michigan. Looks like we have all spectrums of the country tuning in today. So for everyone, if anything resonates with you, we encourage you to use the hashtag AnitaB Elevates to share those aha moments on social media. And don't forget to follow us at AnitaB_org. Please be aware that automated captioning is available for this session. To turn this feature on, click on the closed captioning icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen and select Show Subtitles. As always, there will be a Q&A session at the end of today's chat. So if you want to type any of your questions into the Q&A feature at any point in time in the conversation, we welcome that. We appreciate and encourage all thought-provoking yet respectful questions, as we do with all of our events, and today will be no different. We have a zero-tolerance bullying policy, so any attendee found in violation of this policy will be immediately removed from today's session. We thank you in advance for your cooperation. Unfortunately, Brenda Wilkerson is unable to join us today as she's traveling and is experiencing some pretty terrible technological interruptions at the moment. But we are delighted to welcome Amanda Hill Atkinson, the former Deputy Director of Georgia Equality and the current Head of Programs at AnitaB.org to help moderate this critical conversation with Nadine. Please join me in welcoming our moderator for today's conversation, Amanda Hill Atkinson, the Head of Programs at AnitaB.org.
Thank you, Dr. Two Feathers Orton, for that introduction. Hello, everyone. As you know, we are officially 2 weeks into Pride Month, and while we reflect on the progress that we have made as a nation in the fight for justice, inclusion, equality, and equity, there's still a lot of work to be done. Immediately following this LGBTQIA Pride Month, Florida's Don't Say Gay or Trans bill will officially go into effect on July 1st. Laws based on rhetoric, fear, and hatred, such as the Don't Say Gay and Stop Woke bills, have no place in our society, classrooms, or the workplace. We at AnitaB.org stand firmly in this belief. During today's discussion, you will hear about Equality Florida's advocacy against the Florida discriminatory bill, the inception of the phrase "Don't Say Gay or Trans," the ramifications of such dangerous legislation, and how individuals and organizations can advocate to overturn it. Our guest for today's fireside chat was recently named one of Time Magazine's 100's most influential people of 2022. Nadine Smith is the co-founder and CEO of Equality Florida, the state's largest organization dedicated to ending discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. The former award-winning journalist turned organizer, Nadine was one of 4 co-chairs in the 1993 March on Washington. She was part of the historic Oval Office meeting between then President Clinton, the first such meeting between a sitting president and the gay community leaders. She also served on the founding board of the International Gay and Lesbian Youth Organization, which celebrates 38 years. Nadine is the Florida Chamber Foundation trustee and served on President Obama's National Finance Committee. In 2013, she was named one of the state's most powerful and influential women by the Florida Diversity Council. Nadine was given the League of Women Voters Women of Distinction Award and also serves on the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, the Florida Advisory Committee. She recently received keys to the city of St. Petersburg in 2021. Please help me in welcoming our distinguished guest, Nadine Smith.
Thank you, Anita B., and thank you, Amanda.
Nadine, thank you so much for being here today. Let's dive right in. It's ironic, yet not surprising, that during this year's Pride Month, when we should be celebrating and re-energizing our commitment to support the LGBT plus community, we are weeks away from the implementation of Florida's Don't Say Gay bill. In addition to the physical barriers of access and the damage this bill would create, it will likely fuel the flames of our current pandemic-induced national mental health crisis. Could you talk to us a little bit about the current and potential impact of the legislation, the inception of the phrase "Don't Say Gay," and how this microaggression turned into a movement?
Absolutely. And I think it's important to understand that this doesn't happen without a context. The attack on the LGBTQ community, the efforts through the so-called Stop Woke Act, to curtail and erase America's history and to circumscribe what can be talked about in classrooms goes hand in hand with the censorship and surveillance and erosion of liberties that has been at the forefront of our governor's march towards the White House. And the reason I talk about the march towards the White House is that, in Florida, we have two people that hope to be president. One is Donald Trump and one is Ron DeSantis, and they are competing for the same base. And so what we've seen in these last couple of years is a real departure on DeSantis's part, where he has really embraced fully the culture war strategy of division and polarization. And he's made his primary targets the LGBT community and honest conversations about race, our racist past, and the legacy of that past and how it plays out. So I think what you are seeing is a very orchestrated effort that cares a little about what's actually happening in our state and everything about how to foment grievance and division, and basically to say, hey, listen, if you learn about diversity, equity, and inclusion, what that really means is you're going to learn about how your grandfather was a terrible man, how you know what I mean? It's like, and so this is really intended to say, after the George Floyd summer of uprising, after the progress made around LGBT issues, we are pushing people backwards. And the reason I say that it's important to see it in that context is that this is not new. We saw it in Florida, for example, with the Johns Committee, which was a McCarthy-esque committee set up by the Florida legislature in the 60s. And it had two goals: to purge Black civil rights advocates from the education system and to purge homosexuals. Go 2 decades more and you arrive at Anita Bryant. Once again, after the passage and progress of the Miami Human Rights Ordinance, you had Anita Bryant propped up as the leader of a movement called Save Our Children. And she was funded by the moral majority, which at that time wasn't talking about abortion. They were talking about the integration of private schools by Supreme Court decision. And now, once again, we see this a twin attack on LGBT rights. This bill that we're talking about, the Don't Say Gay bill, and the Stop Woke Act, being brought forward together using the same language, that honest conversations are making people feel bad about themselves, and that has to stop. And by people, they mean white people, uncomfortable, heterosexual people, uncomfortable. And so it is a really dangerous moment because censorship is at the core of these bills. And it's at the core of the message. It is creating a hostile climate for LGBT young people. And so I think it's important for people to understand that we've seen this before. We've seen this messaging, and it is a very, very dangerous messaging. For years, we have seen things getting in better in our schools. There's a thing called the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, and it indicates, depression, suicidality, self-medicating, propensity to drop out. And for a number of years, those numbers have been getting better. In the last 2 years, as we see this onslaught of these bills, those numbers are getting worse. And how does the state of Florida respond? They decide we're going to get rid of the instrument to measure. So it is a very dangerous moment, not simply because of the hostile climate, but this sort of marching authoritarianism and the language they are using, calling LGBTQ people groomers. This is language that is not only intended to dehumanize, it is intended to make harm against our community not only acceptable, but commendable.
As you know, Nadine, this is an issue that is really near and dear to my heart. And as a parent, one of two moms with a 13-year-old daughter, this rhetoric and legislation is terrifying. But others might be saying, well, I'm not gay, so why should I care? This does not relate to me directly. What is your response to that person? And do you believe that the implications of this bill are restricted to the LGBTQIA community?
Not at all. In fact, I think part of the reason I make a point of talking about the Stop Woke Act around race and this bill, we can't even separate it from the restrictions on bodily autonomy and access to abortion as healthcare. All of these things are tied together. But more specifically about the Don't Say Gay bill, what happens? We launched our Safe and Healthy Schools program in the aftermath of the Pulse massacre. And what we said then was we have to get to the source. We have to get to the place where these attitudes of hatred and animosity towards the LGBT community get inculcated. And as we looked at it, we said, school districts have to understand they have the obligation to create not just a place where LGBTQ young people aren't targeted for physical, psychological, and emotional bullying. It actually needs to be a place that reflects their existence. It has to be a place where their families, if you have two moms or two dads, that you don't feel like an outsider. And so the deep investment in that work is the reason that we saw the numbers improving. And now even factoring in COVID, for LGBTQ young people, school has become more hostile. And we're already seeing that. We've had school districts where, they've gone after books like And Tango Makes Three, the true story of two penguins raising a penguin chick, because they've called it inappropriate because the two penguins are male. They've gone after My Two Dads. They've gone after Mama, Mommy, and Me. They've gone after anything that has LGBT characters. They've gone after a number of books simply because they're by Black authors raising issues around, telling historical stories. In fact, they rejected 41% of new math textbooks, saying they were riddled with critical race theory. And as one of the examples, they talked about a math book that references one of the main characters from the movie Hidden Figures, saying that there was no place for talking about the first woman hired by NASA in that role. What was that doing in a math book? So the creeping authoritarianism, the censorship, the curtailing of ideas ought to be a concern for everyone. And in the classroom, interrupting this cycle isn't just about stopping LGBTQ students from being bullied. It's about stopping the system that produces bullies.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So we know that this fight isn't just happening in Florida, but it is definitely making the headlines right now. Your organization, Equality Florida, has been dedicated to securing full equality for Florida's lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer community since 1997, its inception. Please tell us about how your organization's advocacy work against the Don't Say Gay bill is playing out.
Right. Well, a couple of things. We have a website called freetosaygay.org. I'll put a link in for everybody. That is a resource where we share information about what this bill does, because I would put people in two categories. There's the cynical politicians who are using it as a culture war issue to drive towards the presidential nomination. They care more about donors in Iowa and New Hampshire than they do about what's happening in the real world of Floridians. Having said that, there are also people who aren't paying attention. They weren't listening to the hearings. where the sponsors of the bill made it very clear that the intention of this bill was to push kids back into the closet and make kids with gay parents have to hide their families, because they see that the visibility and the normalizing of the fact that we exist, we're part of every community, we're part of every family, we're part of every everything, every aspect of the world, has made it easier for people to come out of the closet. And in fact, this is a generation that arguably was never in the closet. You know, they just came into being who they are. And so the clarity of the rhetoric for anyone paying attention to the legislative process is clear. But for some people who just read the language of the bill, they might go, well, hey, you know, I'm a parent and my wife and I have an 11-year-old son. I don't think K through 3 teachers should be having highly sexualized conversations with my kid. I'd agree with that. But that's not what this bill does. And in fact, it impacts K through 12. And what's really, I think, important for people to understand was during the legislative process, if they simply wanted to say conversations with children in K through 3 shouldn't be over sexualized, and kids shouldn't feel as though they have to, they're being told that they're a gender that they're not, they could have passed that. In fact, they had probably 24 opportunities to pass amendments that made it clear that's what they were up to. But that's not what they were up to. And in fact, you know, my son is just graduated from 4th grade in K through 3. There was no classroom instruction on sex or gender. And so this is how culture wars are fanned. You make up a non-existent problem, find a scapegoat for that problem, and then try to normalize discrimination against the group you've scapegoated. So it's really, you know, for us, there's the pushing back in the political realm, but the other part that's really important is the public education. And then finally, we're taking the governor to court. We are part of a lawsuit challenging this bill that becomes law on July 1st, but we are already seeing its impact in the classroom. So you can look at the intent of the sponsors, and you can also look at what is actually happening today. And for example, in Palm Beach, there was the Palm Beach school board has basically told their teachers that they have to put all of the, basically they've told teachers to put, quote, books submitted for review into closets in the classroom and scour their shelves for books with LGBTQ characters or references to racism. So when we say this is about censorship, this is about surveillance, this is about control, that ought to signal an alarm for everyone.
So I think that brings up a really good point. So where policymakers and society clash, how can we use this as an educational opportunity to foster psychological safety and growth mindset instead of teaching this fear-mongering mindset?
Well, honestly, I think one of the most dangerous things that we've seen happen in Florida and in other places is we are seeing the government telling businesses, you can't do your diversity, equity, and inclusion work. You can't create a safe working environment. And if you do these things, we will create a mechanism that allows employees to sue you if you know, sexual harassment prevention training makes an employee feel uncomfortable about themselves, or if conversations about implicit bias cause anyone to feel discomfort, they can sue. So that it's a very perilous moment. And I think it's critical that people speak from where they are. So there are some companies that have said, you know, point blank, they were warned by DeSantis that they would be punished if they spoke out. And to those companies, I say, this is a gut check moment. You've dedicated decades in creating diversity, equity, and inclusion because you've understood it to be a smart business move. You want to compete for talent. You want to create an environment that you can retain that talent. And you get better productivity when everybody has a sense of belonging. So continue to speak from that. In fact, the Air Force quite recently, and I think other military branches as well, put out a directive that said, if you are stationed in a place like Florida, like Texas, where these bills have passed, and you are not safe and your kids are not safe, we will redeploy you to another place. And increasingly, we're hearing from companies that are doing the same thing. And so, I think all of us have different spheres of influence. Speak out where you are, get involved. The dynamics that cause the passage of this in Florida are not universal. In fact, I want to shout out the Republican governor in Utah, who with tears in his eyes after meeting with trans kids and their parents, vetoed legislation in Utah and said, I've never seen this kind of hatred directed at such a small slice of the population. There were, Republican legislators in other places who spoke out. In fact, in Florida, there were Republican legislators that did the unthinkable, which was break ranks with leadership to vote against this after trying again and again to amend it. But they were all basically Republicans who work closely with kids. They understood just how dangerous this is. So wherever you are, number one, don't assume that the passage of these are inevitable. I think that, we've seen the defeat in some states, but I think it's critical that companies find their moral footing to push back. What we know about bullies is if they discover they can push you, they don't stop. And we cannot allow this attack on honest conversations about race and the existence of LGBTQ people and our right to access healthcare become normalized.
So I think you touched on it. Are you seeing, I know you had mentioned Colorado, are you seeing that there is other legislation that's very similar moving across the nation? Are you hearing from other state groups? And how can citizens of these states kind of do local actions to counter that legislation in the kind of a state level?
Yeah, I would say we have been in close contact with folks from all of the states that are experiencing, these bills being introduced. And in a number of places, they're being, killed before they get to the floor. There have been bipartisan opposition to them. And again, the unique circumstance of being in a state where Republicans control every element of state government and also, have stacked the Supreme Court. Florida is sort of a laboratory right now for how extreme they can get. But that does not mean that's the case state after state after state. So, we're sharing every bit of information that we learn, every resource that we have, and we are seeing our sibling organizations in other states, being successful in stopping these from moving forward. And I think it takes some moral courage. This virtue untested is no virtue. And to, I've said to a number of CEOs and C-suite folks who are struggling because they're feeling pressure internally to be who they said they are. I say to them, you made that investment in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging because it was the right thing for business. You ought to walk in those values, and a decision not to because the governor of Florida or some other extremist politician threatens you, that's a political decision. And I think you should get out of politics and you should get back to keeping the promise that you made to your employees, keeping the promise that you made to their families, and keeping the promise that you made to your customers to be who you said you were.
Yeah, this is very important, of course, to the work of Anita B. We actually had a recent findings from the Anita B 2021 Techies report, which is a equity experience survey, an annual survey of women and non-binary technologists. And it showed that 90% of those surveyed were experiencing some form of discrimination. We know that if you can't show up as your full self to work and be treated with dignity, your psychological safety would be affected and your workplace productivity will suffer. Talk to us a little bit about some of the state regulations on workforce discrimination and how many protections have you seen for human-based on age, race, and gender?
Yeah, so at the local level, over the past couple of decades, we have worked very successfully, often with local partners, to pass local non-discrimination protections that include sexual orientation and gender identity. And of course, the Bostock decision by the Supreme Court that defines sex discrimination as sexual orientation and gender identity inclusive means that right now the Florida Commission on Human Relations is treating discrimination cases that are based on sexual orientation and gender identity precisely as they would ones based on sex, race, etc. Now, that is a terribly underfunded, department, but it remains that no matter where you live in the state of Florida, you can file those you access that system. The message that's being sent out here is really so nefarious because it goes to the heart of who we are. It says that we cannot exist in safe space. We have schools that have been told to take down rainbow stickers. We had in Sarasota, 4 teachers were told to take down their coexist posters, which is all about religious diversity. They were told to take them down because they had a rainbow motif. That is the level of extremism that has been wrought here. We have we have teachers leaving the state, quitting their profession because they're unwilling to turn their back on students by adhering to both the rhetoric of the law and the letter of a law that says, like my son, most kids do a family tree as part of their, somewhere in 2nd or 3rd grade. And number one, does that count as instruction? If he draws the picture of, my wife and I and him and our dog. And what if a kid says something? Hey, those are 2 women. Where's the dad or where's the mom? If a teacher feels as though they can't say, hey, some families have a mom and a dad like you, and some have 2 moms and some have 2 dads, and some families have just 1 parent. There's a lot of different ways that families are configured, and all families ought to be respected. Did that teacher just open their school up for a lawsuit? And what's so pernicious about this law is not only did they open themselves up for a lawsuit, but they've done it in such a way that even if you file a frivolous lawsuit, they have written it so that the school district can't even go after you for, attorney's fees. So basically, they've put a bounty. They have incentivized the harassment of teachers who do their job well and school districts that look out for their LGBTQ kids. And because what's the disincentive in just suing? There's no accountability for you if you decide to, and that's not an accident.
Yeah. And teachers are under such enormous amount of pressure right now. Anyway,
we have a shortage of teachers, and they've just gone through COVID. And I will say this, I think, as a parent, if you ask me, who do I trust with the safety of my kid? A teacher or a politician? A teacher every single time.
Yeah.
And it doesn't even take us reflecting on school shootings to understand that aside from being a parent, who else has a history of putting their body on the line to protect kids? And so it's been a season of just relentless insulting and denigrating of teachers, and at a time when, they're underpaid, overworked, just got through COVID, under-resourced in so many ways, and insulted. And so, yes, we're losing great teachers in the state of Florida. There's been lots of articles written about teachers, saying I can't go back to a classroom where, it was hard to begin with, and now it's been made harder, and they expect me to turn my back on kids who need support. And that's the damage. But again, these aren't being driven by things that are happening in the state of Florida. They're being driven by a very cynical campaign for president.
Orchestrated. So I'd like to kind of move a question around building allies. As you know, the term intersectionality, which describes the overlap of a person's social and political identities to create different modes of discrimination and oppression, guides most of the work that we do at AnitaB.org, particularly as it relates to intersectional gender and pay parity. How would you encourage potential allies and those who may not fall into the oppressed community to advocate against these systems of oppression?
Well, I really do think that there are a lot of people feeling very conflicted right now. As I said, their companies have been warned to allow these culture war, flames to grow. And, I think many of us who care about equality, who care about justice, might look back and say, hey, had I been there at that time, I would have stood up. I wouldn't have let that happen at a lunch counter, not on my watch. We all have a sense that we would have in that moment done the right thing. And I would say to everybody, we're in that moment. You have the opportunity to do the right thing. You have the opportunity to make your voice heard. get involved in school districts. Most of the people who are showing up under Moms for Liberty or whatever AstroTurf name they've given themselves don't even have school kids in the schools, and yet they are just determining what your kids can read, what they can be, what ideas, what conversations they can have. There are even places where they have, told kids you can't talk to other students about being gay or about being trans. So it is a really dangerous thing that we see happening.
Yeah, I think that that's exactly right. I want to open it up to a call to action to the audience. If our audience takes away one message and one action item from today's conversation, what would you want that to be?
Well, right now, I think it's important that Florida really is at an epicenter right now, and we are pushing back. We have a lawsuit. We have education campaigns. I would say every way that you can support our efforts here with talent and treasure, please do. freetosaygay.org is a great portal to see the ways that you can be involved. And obviously, we're talking to people with tremendous skill sets that could be brought to bear. And there's somebody out there thinking about an idea about how to turn what you're able to do into a tool that we can use. I'd love to talk to you about that. And understand that what we learn here, we share with every state that's facing the same battle. And it's really terrific to have such a collaborative relationship with state orgs all over the country. But don't be silent. Do not let this be normalized. And the scary thing about authoritarianism is it's not one single blow, it's 1,000 cuts that we absorb, and it becomes the new normal. And we really have to, rage against the dying of the light in our democracy right now. Absolutely.
And I think on that note, and of course, in the heart of Pride, how are you and your organization celebrating Pride Month in Florida and pushing against that?
Well, there are two things that give me a lot of hope right now. Number one, I always say to people, I'm going to tell you how bad it is. This is really a dangerous moment. They're using the language that you use when you want to create an open season for violence against a community. Right. So we got to take it very, very seriously. That being said, there are two things that give me hope. One of them is the overwhelming response from students, from young people, who organized student-led walkouts, who got themselves to Tallahassee to testify, who have opened up voter registration efforts on their campuses. And when administrators told them that they couldn't talk about this thing that really defined so much of their senior year, they found clever ways to deliver that message anyway. And I think that there's a miscalculation about where the generation that is coming into the voting stream right now. And the other thing that gives me a great deal of hope is what we experienced around marriage equality. We saw 38 defeats, 15 in 1 year, and each one of them was a gut punch where people said, you cannot have for you, the person you love, your kids, what I have for my family. And then we started to look at the numbers in the aftermath of those defeats. And what we discovered was support across the board for everything we cared about was increasing, even marriage equality in places where we'd lost at the ballot box. Mm-hmm. And that's what gave us the confidence to go after marriage equality in Florida. And it taught us to talk from the heart, to tell people who we are, to tell our love stories, not just antiseptic conversations about healthcare benefits and inheritance and things like that. And it changed the entire scenario. And so I think that we're in a similar place where they are sprinting as fast as they can to push back on progress. And I think they're going to experience, the Streisand effect, where, Barbra Streisand wanted to stop the Google Maps from having the aerial view of her home, on the website. She asked them to take it down. She went to court. And in the end, she wasn't successful. When she started, only four people had downloaded a picture. By the time the dust settled, millions had. I think somewhere between 4 and 6 million people had. And I think similarly, they're doing everything they can to silence, to erase, to censor, to ban. And instead, what we're seeing is a generation that is saying there's no way we're going not only are we not going backwards, they have not known a world where they were not represented. They have not known a school in which they couldn't find books. They have not known a world where the television didn't have characters that resembled their lives in some way. So they're trying to push young people back to a world they never even experienced. And so I hope the same thing happens when people wake up and understand how they've been played and how the people they love, their own family members, their own classmates, their own neighbors, their own coworkers have been dehumanized, labeled groomers, put in danger, that they'll stand up and they won't let those comments go unchallenged. I want to see every straight person who believes in equality show up for the Pride event. Don't be afraid that there was a U-Haul full of white supremacists who headed to Coeur d'Alene to menace the LGBTQ community. They had their pride anyway. So if young people who have few resources, sometimes no support at home even, can muster and stand up to DeSantis, then those of us who are adults, those of us who have resources, those of us who are in positions of power in companies, surely we can do the same.
Thank you. Thank you, Nadine. Thank you so much for joining today, and thank you for your thoughtful responses. I know you inspire me, and I'm sure you have our audience today to not only stay vigilant, but to take action. Now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Two Feathers Orton to open up the Q&A and to invite questions from our viewers.
Thank you, Amanda. So the first question from our audience comes from me. Nadine, you spoke of one of the current movements from academia, which is where I'm from, and also it's taking a lot of pressure and momentum in the general public that some refer to as tell us or teach us our true histories, which embraces facing both the good and the bad in our history, the history of our country, our policies, and in some cases the people, which you've hinted at. This movement is in fact a really relevant parallel to what Pride Month celebrates, which is let us live our truth, right? So I'm wondering, what truths do you think policymakers need to accept and become enlightened about to better inform their policymaking, to better protect LGBTQ plus rights and equality?
Yeah, I think I began by saying I divide this conversation into two categories. Cynical politicians, like I don't even know that DeSantis believes half the things that come out of his mouth, but he sees the political pathway. And, there's no reasoning there because that's driven by polling numbers, that's driven by political strategy. But I have lots of patience to engage people who step into this conversation without context. Because what we discover pretty quickly is, again, if I had just seen this bill and had no context, I would go, yeah, I don't think students should be having, or teachers should be having, highly sexualized conversations with my kid. What, did something happen? What's going on? And pretty quickly somebody would say, no, it's not happening. And this is a law that, and once we give people context, they go, I got it. They understand. So I think the education piece is really important. But in terms of people being able to be their authentic selves and face facts about our country's history, that's a critical part of the maturing process. Like, we've got to figure out as a country at a time when we have the collision of two demographic realities, what they call the graying of America and the browning of America, which means because of healthcare disparities and because of, institutional racism, white people tend to live longer, and the birth rate among Black and brown people is higher than among white people. And so what you have is a nation that is increasingly controlled politically by the graying of America, and yet the future is multicultural. And so to chart a path, the choices that we're being given right now is make America great again, push back against that progress, get people to remember their place, get women to remember their place, get LGBTQ people back in the closet, and let's stop talking about racism. Let's start talking about, now we want to be colorblind. That that leads us to these, build a wall, anti-immigrant, all of these sort of tropes that have a vision of America that is essentially white, Christian, and heterosexual. And then there's the other vision, which says, you know what, you get to be who you are. You get to have the faith you have. There's no racial superiority. We are, our diversity is our strength. And there's an economic path for everyone to have prosperity. My kid, your kid. And that's the America that we want to build. And that's the America that diversity, equity, and inclusion recognizes is America. And the clash of these two visions of what America ought to be and what America will be are playing out now in our classrooms and in our workplaces through this kind of legislation.
So very true. It's fascinating, but also heart-wrenching that in a world where we are all clearly already here, that we still have to defend ways for which we can belong safely, both physically, psychologically, legally. I want to, address some of the questions in the audience. And as we're thinking more about your words of wisdom, we have several questions. I'm going to try to get through them as well as I can. Thank you from the audience. So for starters, Deneen asked, how can they actually do this, the Don't Say Gay, if we have freedom of speech?
Well, that's part of the reason we're in court right now, among others, what the governor of Florida has made clear is he doesn't really care about the Constitution. And in fact, if you Google him, there's several articles where the headline is essentially DeSantis is a lawyer's best friend, because so many of the things that he has pushed have been challenged and shot down. But this is about, shopping for the venue that will affirm discrimination. Some of these bills that are passing now were introduced years ago and they had no future whatsoever. But that is how, people think that, things change in huge and dramatic ways, but sometimes they just grind down over time. And so, to folks who are wondering, I don't live in the United States or I don't live in Florida, what can I do? Raise your voice, because, the same people that drove Brexit were behind, politics in America. There are ways of that you condemning what you are seeing in the United States sends a signal. I remember when I was part of IGLEO, the International Gay Lesbian Youth Organization, we did a kiss in at the Statue of Eros to protest, I think they were called sexual apartheid laws in London. And we did it specifically because we were an international, group of young people and we were willing to be arrested. So I say all that to say that in these moments, wherever you are, raise your voice, call on your local government to condemn this kind of thing, call on Parliament to condemn these kinds of things. But we have to make noise. We have to push back. I know in the war in Ukraine, the Russian attacks on Ukraine, that people began to leave Yelp reviews on Russian businesses to try to break through the blockade of honest information. So I'm saying there's no limit to the creative ways that we can have our voices heard. And I believe that one of the things I'm going to put in my diary is that on June 16th, I had this conversation with AnitaB.org. And in that conversation, I found the person who had that brilliant idea. And we need all hands on deck right now, every oar in the water.
Absolutely. And I think you just with that response, you answered one of the other audience questions, which was raised by AJ, who is in the UK. And I think that many others also have the same question, which is what can we do if we're not, in the US, if we're abroad, because this fight is everywhere. And I think you bring up some really important points, which is sometimes you have to forget the rules. You have to break the stereotype of what are the normal venues for productive conversation. If people aren't allowing you to speak, if people aren't inviting you to the table, if you're not made visible, do everything you can, be creative. We also have several other questions. One is, as a nation, we've fallen short in our professed ideals of equality and ensuring that discrimination doesn't happen. There continues to be roadblocks where advocacy actions have been thwarted, and that this is pervasive. So, and that basically any group can be targeted. So the question that the audience is getting at is, all advocacy work needs to include fundamental human rights. And in your view, where are the gaps that prevent people from being safe?
Well,
I know that's heavy.
Yeah, no, well, good. It should be. This is the moment that we're in. A lot of people quote the Niemöller, first they came for the, trade unionists, first they came. And part of me wants to say, why can't you see the humanity on who they came for first? Why did it have to come to your door before you responded? Because all of our fates are tied. So right now, understand that they attack who they consider the weakest and most politically vulnerable, and they sharpen their sword there, and then they continue. So 2 years ago, it was trans youth playing sports in elementary and high school, right? Now, Florida had policies in place for over a decade to ensure fairness and access to sports for trans kids. But because a think tank, said the prescription for raising funds and angering your base is in caricaturing who these kids are, go for it. And so out of nowhere, in a state where I can't imagine, less than 10 kids over the course of a decade accessed the process to be allowed to play in schools. That became the number one issue. And so they went after trans kids because they thought this is the most vulnerable population that doesn't have the political wherewithal to push back. And having gained momentum by that, they came after the entire LGBTQ community, and they parlayed they watched what happened in North Carolina when businesses said to the North Carolina legislature and governor, we can't perform in your venues. We can't bring business to your state. We will not show up and boost your economy if you won't respect the basic humanity of our members, our consumers, et cetera. And North Carolina backed away from that position, and the governor didn't win re-election. We saw the same in Georgia when they voted for they introduced voter suppression legislation. I think it was Delta and Coca-Cola and some others that stood up. And that's what they're supposed to do. But the lesson that the extremists took from that was, let's go after businesses and make them afraid to continue to walk the talk. So let me, before we run out of time, be as direct as possible. If you live in Florida, we certainly need you. Please volunteer, please reach out. Wherever you live, you can support us financially, and the free-to-say-gay.org website has a easy way to click and make a contribution. It also has a link to volunteer, and there's lots of ways to volunteer remotely. We do a lot of things. We're a big state, so we have to have lots of remote ways to engage. But I think no matter where you live in the United States, there are these AstroTurf organizations that are seeking to take over school districts and indoctrinate children with messages that there's only, one faith, one belief system, one way to be an American, and anything that contradicts that is being put in a closet in the classroom while they review it for removal. Books are being taken off shelves right now for no other reason than they portray honest conversations about race, or they include LGBTQ people in the casual, ordinary way that any other character is included. this is a very dangerous moment. So I really ask everyone, help in whatever way is available to you. And we've always been an organization willing to, work outside the mold with, and on the tech side of things, I think, the young people have been lighting the path for amplifying our messaging. So that's the moment. That's the moment we're in, and Florida's at the epicenter of it, and we've got to push back because a lot of other states are counting on us to win.
Nadine, you have spoken so eloquently to the reason, the purpose, and the drive behind allyship and advocacy in its finest. Thank you for your words of wisdom on what we can do. We don't have any more time for questions. So for the audience members, Nadine has provided her email address. And although we don't have any more time, I want to turn it over to Amanda to close it out. But I want to first say thank you, Nadine, for your light, for your wisdom, for your hard work, and this worthwhile fight for equity. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a pleasure hosting this conversation today.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Two Feathers Orton. Nadine, again, thank you so much for bringing this meaningful conversation to us. Your commitment to Equality Florida and all of the work that you do inspires us. It keeps us going here at Anita B to serve and advance women and non-binary technologists on their pathways to thrive. We look forward to continuing to partnering with you, very specifically with you, to really drive this change. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in to Elevated Conversations today, presented by AnitaB.org. We appreciate your continued support of every one of you. Please remember to visit the resources page on AnitaB.org's membership site for more useful information and actions that you can take to help advocate for the LGBTQIA community in Florida and across the country. If you've enjoyed today's discussion, we invite you to visit ghc.anitab.org for more information on this year's annual Grace Hopper celebration, the world's largest gathering of women and non-binary technologists that is happening on September 20th through 23rd in Orlando, Florida. This will be a hybrid event with opportunities to join both in person and virtually. And while we realize that the Don't Say Gay bill officially goes into effect on July 1st, we want our attendees to know that we are committed to creating a safe space and all are welcome. We are intentionally working to cultivate long-lasting relationships with those on the ground in Florida who stand for equality, equity, and justice. And so we invite you to stand with us and lift your voices. Be sure to look out for the next Elevating Conversations event via our newsletter and follow us on social media at AnitaB_.org to be among the first to know all of the details that are coming. Thank you again for joining us today.